The body had been motionless for far too long to still be a choice. The stiffness came not only from the cold, but from the need to avoid drawing attention from the very air. The legs didn't ache as before. They ached in a deeper way, as if the pain had grown tired of wanting and had decided simply to stay. The thin fabric clung to the damp skin, and the dampness chilled where the cloth ended. The weight of the body seemed greater than the body itself, a borrowed weight, placed there by waiting. The cold slowed everything down, even thought, even breathing. When someone inhaled too deeply, the sound seemed loud, indecent. They learned to breathe without seeming alive, mouths closed, tongues quiet, chests rising only as much as necessary. At some point before the place, they had already understood that existing was a risk. It wasn't an idea. It was a rule that the body kept on its own. Their eyes didn't meet. Not for lack of courage, but because a look could be read as a challenge, a plea, a sign of weakness. A look could be interpreted. And in war, being interpreted by a man in power almost never ended well. So their gazes remained loud, fixed on the dirty ground, on the edge of a boot, on a dark stain that no one wanted to name. Sometimes their vision blurred, and someone blinked slowly, like someone turning off a light from the inside to save energy. There was a kind of silence they knew well. It wasn't peace. It was suspension. It was when everything was about to happen, and no one said what. This silence had weight. It pushed their shoulders down. It tightened their throats. It made their skin seem more exposed. It was the silence of someone in control who knows they don't need to speak. And at that moment, it was everywhere, between them, above them, like a low ceiling. They awaited an order. They awaited a scream. They awaited anything that would confirm what their bodies had already decided, that the next stage would be worse. The worsening was always the most predictable part. The worsening came with a terrible naturalness. No one there needed to imagine much. For them, imagination had been replaced by memory. The hands, where there were still hands, remained close to their own bodies, as if holding their breath were possible. Some gripped their elbows tightly, not to warm them, but to remember that they were still whole. Others let their arms hang limp, heavy, without the energy even for a protective gesture. One of them trembled so slightly that it seemed more like a defect than a tremor. A minimal, insistent movement that asked no permission. No one dared ask what came next, not because they didn't want to know, but because knowing might be more than they could bear. The question might draw attention. The question might provoke. The question might become a motive. And in that place, motives were easily manufactured. They had learned that the best thing was to offer nothing, not a word, not a glance, not an explanation, just to be there, trying to diminish, trying to be less. The feeling of condemnation came before any sentence. It was a kind of ancient certainty, ingrained in the body like hunger. Even when nothing was happening, they felt as if something had already happened, as if the end was merely delayed. And the delay was not relief. The delay was the cruelest part. The sound of footsteps in the distance didn't need to be loud to change the air. The ground seemed to warn beforehand, a slight vibration, an approaching rhythm. The muscles responded in advance without consultation. The belly tightened. Her empty stomach contracted as if it still had something to lose. And for a moment, they all became quieter than they already were, as if the silence could make them disappear. When the figure appeared, there was no surprise. Surprise was a thing of another time. The presence of a man in uniform was merely continuity. His face seemed too ordinary to wield so much power. This was one of the hardest things to accept, the normality of what could happen. He didn't need to appear cruel. Cruelty, they knew, rarely came with clear signs. Often it came with indifference. He stopped close enough for them to feel the accompanying chill, the smell of damp fabric, of leather, of old smoke. He didn't need to touch anyone to change everything. Simply being there was enough. Simply looking was enough. And even his gaze seemed a calculated gesture, as if choosing where to look was part of the control. They didn't raise their heads. They kept their eyes downcast, as always. Their bodies stiffened by waiting. Their bodies ready to obey. Their bodies prepared for the worst before the worst arrived. Because, until then, it had almost always been like that. Nothing has been said yet. And that was the hardest part. The order hadn't come yet, but the body was already behaving as if it had heard it. That's how it worked now. Even before someone opened their mouth, something inside it was preparing for the impact. Shoulders slightly hunched, neck drawn in. An almost invisible adjustment, repeated so many times that it had become automatic. It wasn't posture. It was defense. The war had taught them that every order carried something hidden. It was never just what it seemed. A simple word could mean exposure. A small gesture could become a reason for laughter. A neutral request was almost always followed by something that took more than it gave. They had learned this without class, without explanation, without warning. They had learned it by observing other women. They had learned it by feeling it in their own bodies. That's why they didn't react. Not reacting was a way to minimize harm. Their faces remained still, even when something was slowly breaking inside. Their bodies stayed quiet, not out of courage, but because reacting drew attention, and attention was dangerous. They had seen what happened to those who moved too much, who asked questions, who didn't understand quickly enough. There was also the expectation of laughter. Not a loud, open laugh, but that short, crooked laugh that came with glances between men. A laugh that didn't need words to humiliate. They had been observed like that before. They knew how to recognize the moment when they ceased to be people and became something to be talked about, pointed at, used to break the boredom. At some point in the war, the idea of being ridiculed had become as likely as cold or hunger. It was part of the scenery, part of the routine. It didn't happen often, but it happened often enough to be expected, and the body once again anticipated it. I would accept the worst before it happened, because waiting for the impact was more bearable than being surprised by it. They didn't think of dignity as a concept. They thought about getting through the next minute without losing more than they already had. They thought about not falling. They thought about not crying. They thought about keeping their faces firm enough not to offer satisfaction. Each one made this calculation in silence, without exchanging words, without agreeing on anything. Even so, there was a kind of invisible agreement between them, to endure together, even when separated. The man remained there. His presence effortlessly sustained the fear. He didn't need to come any closer. He didn't need to raise his voice. His authority lay in the space he occupied, in the time he controlled. And they knew that when the order finally came, it would be non-negotiable. It never was. The lesson of war had been this: obey quickly, feel later, swallow now, survive a little longer. The body accepted this as absolute truth, and at that moment, while nothing was yet happening, the worst was already happening inside them. The voice came effortlessly. It wasn't loud. It wasn't harsh. It was short. Few words, spoken as if performing a common task. And that's precisely what made the air even heavier. There was no emotion there to cling to. No clear sign of what would come next. Just the dry sound of an order that explained nothing. For a moment, no one was sure they understood. Not because the words were difficult, but because their meaning seemed too open-ended. The simplicity was confusing. At other times, simple orders had been the beginning of something long, or the end. It was impossible to know. War had taught that clarity was no guarantee of security. The body reacted before any thought could organize itself. A small, almost imperceptible movement swept through the group. An adjustment of position, a restrained step, a raising of hands that didn't ask for permission, only obeyed. No one questioned. No one asked for repetition. Questioning had never improved anything. Obedience didn't come from trust. It came from habit, a reflex trained by the repetition of fear. They knew that hesitation could be interpreted as defiance. They knew that not understanding quickly enough could become a reason, so they did what they had always done. They followed, even without fully understanding. As they moved, a persistent doubt spread silently. What exactly was being taken from them now? It wasn't just something material. It never was. There was always another layer, something not immediately visible, but which left deeper marks. And this uncertainty made their stomachs clench even tighter, as if their bodies were trying to prepare for a loss that didn't yet have a form. The man watched without haste. His gaze followed each gesture, not with visible interest, but with enough attention to maintain control. He seemed to assess not only what they were doing, but how they were doing it. The speed, the hesitation, the posture. Small things that could become big without warning. They continued, one movement after another, without exchanging glances, without words, each one focused on not making a mistake. Even without knowing exactly what the mistake would be, the silence remained intact, broken only by the faint sound of clothes moving, of feet touching the cold floor. Nothing more was said. And again, the lack of explanation hurt more than any lengthy order, because it left too much room for imagination. And imagination, fueled by experience, was rarely kind. The order had been simple, but everything she was carrying was too heavy to be simple as well. After the order, nothing came. No follow-up, no confirmation. Time simply stood there, open, like a wound that doesn't bleed, but also doesn't heal. They remained where they were, unsure if this was part of the instruction or just another imposed break to tire them out. The wait stretched on without any sign of ending, and this began to weigh more heavily than any movement. The silence now seemed intentional. It wasn't carelessness, it was method. The absence of words created a space where each one had to deal alone with what she imagined. For some, the thoughts raced too fast. For others, they stalled. In both cases, the body felt it first. Tension rose in the shoulders, accumulated in the nape of the neck, and stiffened the jaw. The exhaustion took on another form. It wasn't just physical, it was weariness. Silence was interpreted as contempt, as if it wasn't worth explaining, as if they didn't deserve to know. This interpretation didn't need to be spoken aloud. It was understood in the same language that the war had taught from the beginning. A language made of incomplete gestures, of cut-off orders, of glances that never lingered too long. To avoid collapse, the mind sought repetition, counting breaths, repeating a name in thought, fixing the gaze on a specific point on the floor. Simple, almost childlike strategies, but effective enough to keep everything in place for a few more minutes. Each had her own. None spoke about it. There was no energy to share. The fear of making a mistake grew along with the waiting. Any movement seemed too dangerous. Adjusting a foot, straightening the back, coughing. Everything could be interpreted as disobedience, as impatience, as something out of place. So immobility became a forced choice. Better to look like a statue than to draw attention. The man remained present, even when he wasn't moving. The feeling of being watched didn't disappear. On the contrary, it intensified, as if every second were a silent evaluation, as if time were being used to measure resistance, submission, fatigue. Nothing was happening, and that was the worst part, because while nothing was happening outside, everything inside was in turmoil. The body struggled not to give in, the mind struggled not to rush, and in this constant effort, the waiting was beginning to hurt more than any action that might come afterward. It was a small gesture, so small that, at another time, it might have gone unnoticed. But there, in that context, it felt almost wrong. A movement that didn't fit with the accumulated waiting, nor with the calculated silence, nor with everything they had learned to anticipate. There was no hurry. There was no abruptness, just a gesture that seemed out of place. For a moment, no one knew how to react. The body, prepared for the impact, didn't encounter it. The mind, trained to interpret threats, couldn't fit it into any known pattern. It was as if the scene had lost its expected rhythm, as if something had deviated from the invisible script of cruelty. The man's behavior didn't follow the usual pattern. There was no irony, no comments, no exchange of knowing glances with others, no sign of amusement, just the continuation of an act that, surprisingly, didn't seem interested in humiliating anyone. This absence began to cause confusion, a physical confusion before it became mental. They waited for the compliment, the comment that would come after, the brief laugh, the observation that would reduce everything to what they already knew. But nothing came. The space remained open, strange, almost unstable, and in that unexpected void, something began to waver within them. The body reacted first. A muscle relaxed without permission. A sigh escaped deeper than allowed. Someone blinked too quickly, as if waking up. These small signs were unplanned. They happened because the body, for a second, stopped defending itself against something that didn't come. The absence of mockery was difficult to process, not because it was desired, but because its lack dismantled an old certainty. It was easier to deal with the predictable, even when it hurt. This, however, was different. That demanded something else. It demanded attention. It demanded presence. It demanded accepting that, perhaps, not everything there would follow the same old path. The silence shifted in weight. It didn't become lighter. It became different, less threatening, but more unsettling, as if announcing something that didn't yet have a name. And while they tried to understand what was happening, they realized that something, even something small, had already happened within them. It took them a while to realize it. It wasn't immediate. The war hadn't taught them to recognize limits placed in their favor. Limits, when they existed, tended to tighten, not protect. Therefore, the realization came slowly, almost painfully. Something in that behavior indicated that they weren't being treated as things in transit, nor as bodies available for use or ridicule. There was a restraint there, an unexpected break. It wasn't explicit kindness. There were no sweet words, no grand gestures. It was more subtle than that. A dry care, a respect that didn't ask for thanks and didn't announce any intention. Precisely because it was simple, it was confusing, because it didn't seem like a performance. It didn't seem meant to be seen. It was simply there, interrupting the usual flow of things. At some point, it became clear that there was a limit, a point where he wouldn't go any further. And that was something they almost no longer knew how to recognize. A limit imposed where none was expected, not exactly to protect them, but to say, without saying it, that it wouldn't go any further, that there would be no exposure, that there would be no laughter. The shock didn't come with force. It came as a strange emptiness. The absence of ridicule weighed on them differently. It didn't hurt, but it disoriented them. They had prepared themselves to shrink even further, to endure yet another layer of humiliation. And suddenly, that layer wasn't there. The body, ready to resist, didn't know what to do with it. Accepting that moment was difficult, almost physical, as if relaxing were too dangerous, as if letting their guard down could cost them dearly later. Some remained rigid, even when nothing demanded rigidity. Others felt a sudden urge to cry, not from relief, but from exhaustion. Dignity, when it returns after being taken away so many times, doesn't come back whole. It arrives strange, uncomfortable. No one thanked anyone. No one said anything. It wasn't a moment for words. It was a moment of silent recognition, of realizing that there, for a brief and fragile interval, the logic of war had been interrupted, not defeated, not reversed, just suspended. The man walked away without making a scene, without looking back, without demanding a reaction. And that was perhaps the hardest part to understand, because it left them with the burden of dealing with what had happened, alone, without instructions, without explanations. They remained there for a few more seconds, their bodies still tense, their minds lagging behind what their bodies were already feeling. Something had changed. It wasn't big, it wasn't visible, but it was there, and neither of them would leave that moment exactly as they had entered it. What came after had no clear form. There was no closure, no final explanation, only the feeling that something had been put back, albeit imperfectly. The body took a while to understand. It remained on alert, as if at any moment the world could correct that deviation and everything would return to the familiar place of pain. But the moment was not undone. It remained there, even after it had passed. The internal change didn't present itself as hope. It was more subtle than that. An almost imperceptible alteration in the way she carried her own weight, as if, for a moment, it wasn't necessary to shrink so much, as if the idea of being seen without being diminished had left a trail difficult to ignore, something too small to celebrate, too big to forget. Dignity didn't return as a word, it returned as a feeling, an internal adjustment, a boundary recognized too late to become security, too soon to disappear. No one promised anything, no one explained intentions. Yet, something essential had been preserved without announcement, and that, in war, was rare. The final silence was no longer the same silence as the beginning. There was still fear, still caution, still weariness, but there was also disbelief, a restrained, almost uncomfortable disbelief, as if accepting that moment was, in itself, a risk, as if believing too much could make the next fall even harder. They didn't talk about it. They probably never would. The war left no room for reflection, only for moving on. But the body holds things that the mouth cannot reach. And that moment, brief and strange, would remain stored there, not as salvation, not as a lesson, just as silent proof that, even in that scenario, something different had been possible. And that changed everything. Not all at once, not forever, but enough not to be forgotten. Some people move on, others stay a little longer. The stories continue here for those who choose to stay.